Welcome to the Modern Athenas podcast with Sonia and Debbie, where we discuss how regular women became Athenas in their own time by working hard, persevering through the challenges in their lives, and contributing to a better world. We want to welcome our listeners back after our summer break. This is podcast 26, our first podcast of season 2. In this podcast, we will be discussing the book Educating Esme by Esme Raji Codell. You can use the link on our website at modernathenas.com to order the book after the podcast. Today in the U.S., we rely on teachers for far more than teaching our children for 8 hours a day in the classroom. But elementary school teachers are expected to be so much more than a teacher of reading, writing, math, and language arts. They are expected to be surrogate parents, healthcare professionals, security guards, family mediators, and diagnosticians, all while preparing their students for endless required testing that the government believes will show whether or not they are good teachers. Under these pressures, teachers are also supposed to be creative problem solvers, making do with little supplies and funding to create rooms of imagination and purpose where their students will be engaged each day. And, did I forget to mention? They have to do all of this with very little pay. Educating Esme is about Esme's, or Madame Esme as her students call her, first year teaching of 5th grade in a rough and tumble area of Chicago. Esme takes the reader along during the summer before her teaching career starts as she accepts a position in a new public school. Esme has a tireless energy of all young new teachers and a deep-rooted belief that no matter what, it is the students that matter. As you listen to her classroom tales, you can't help but draw parallels between Esme and her classroom and new leaders and their teams in the workplace. The lessons are the same and the results are predictable. Leaders succeed when they own everything about their job and their team, and the team succeeds when the leader is engaged and the team is invested in the mission. Why did they hire me? Quote, I'm surprised Mr. Turner hired me, only 24 years old, to help him open a brand new public school. You would think he would want someone more experienced. The interview was very brief. He asked me, how would you describe your classroom discipline style? I answered, assertive. He said, what does that mean? It means I say what I mean and I mean what I say, I replied. Well, say you're having a problem with the student. How would you deal with it? I would document the child's behavior and then try interventions, such as using successive approximations towards our goal or home involvement, depending on the individual situation, I explained. After a silence, I added, I wouldn't call the office every 5 minutes. He closed the little notebook in his lap and announced, you're hired. So as I was reading this, I was thinking, that assertiveness in an interview is a really good skill rather than just kind of, wavering, I don't know what I would do, it would be situation dependent. And then, listening to her also talk about what she would do, and that follow through that she would have as a leader and kind of owning that problem herself rather than saying, I would pass it off to you, Mr. Turner, or, I would, go call the parent and let the parent handle it.
Yeah, I thought that Mr. Turner, it was interesting. He didn't necessarily, I think he appreciated that she had a plan, and all this was kind of almost theory at this point in her life because she hadn't actually put it into action yet. But I think what he appreciated most was she had a plan, but also she was ready to kind of be independent as well. And I think he must be reacting to people who did call the office every 5 minutes and leaned on him to kind of, for more guidance and more hand-holding than he really wanted to be able to offer. He really wanted that independence as well.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good lesson especially for new leaders, which is you don't run to your sort of boss all the time for every answer. Like some of this stuff, it's trial and error, and you've got to figure it out and you've got to work through it yourself. And you're not always going to have the right answer, and you're definitely not always going to do sort of the right thing or as you get better at being a leader, you'll sort of come up with better answers. But a lot of it is kind of trial by fire or trial and error. And you've got to try things out because if you don't, you're always going to be scared or nervous to make those decisions on your own. So yeah, you've got to try stuff out.
Well, and I also felt like Esme had been told that she was assertive, either that or she was describing what people have told her about maybe her personality of being, she's a very plain and direct and getting to kind of the core of the issue type of person, which she put a positive spin that he actually latched onto, which was assertive. But there are other ways that people maybe had described her personality in the past that, and I'm probably reading way too much into this, but I thought that, it was, she put up the most positive spin on what that she sees as the core of her message, and he latched onto it.
Ha. No, I don't know. I read the same sort of thing into it. She says assertive. I was thinking aggressive. Um, Sometimes when you're a very assertive or brazen or bold personality, especially as a woman, people take that to be very aggressive. So you've got to be careful when you're being sort of forward and assertive that you also aren't too assertive to the degree that people are going to read you as aggressive. Because if you're too aggressive, people get defensive. And once people get defensive, they start acting differently towards you and they view your opinions very differently. So there's kind of this like fine line you got to walk with that assertiveness.
Yeah, it's not as being assertive necessarily with people or aggressive with people, but it's being assertive and aggressive with kind of the task at hand, I think. And we'll see. It's interesting, though. I find a little ironic that it begins this way because Mr. Turner, as we see the story unfold, does not necessarily always appreciate the way that Esme's assertiveness unfolds. So,
Right, right. It is very ironic. The Fairy Tale Festival proposal. Esme wrote a proposal for a fairy tale festival at the school. Mr. Turner, the principal, approved it, but it had to go through administrators, teachers, and community members. Eventually, the proposal was blocked. Quote, I showed my idea to the librarian to be. She was skeptical. That's typical. If you give people an idea these days, they just think you are sharing it with them so that they can critique it, play devil's advocate, and so on. It doesn't occur to them that they might help or get enthused or at least have the courtesy to get out of your way. Even if I fail, I have to try and try and try. It may be exhausting, but that's besides the point. The goal is not necessarily to succeed, but to keep trying, to be the kind of person who has ideas and to see them through. We'll see. I aim too high, probably. But if I don't aim, how will I hit anywhere near the target? End quote. So here she is. She's, again, here's this young teacher. She comes up with this idea, this she wants to have this fairy tale festival, which really is just to, excite the kids into reading and excite them into learning. And everybody's this critic and, yet she refuses to kind of give up. And instead she's trying this sort of adjustment or going around these critiques to, try and get her ideas to work. And by doing that, she just refuses to give up. And so she's coming up with these sort of creative problem solving. And I admired that about her. And throughout the book, she kind of comes up with these creative ways to get around these sort of naysayers.
Yeah, I think that I love the way she brings creativity into the classroom, and we'll get to showcase some of those ways. But I thought it was interesting that a fairy tale festival, which is, rooted around, like you said, kind of getting these children excited about reading and imagination, that the librarian of all people wasn't going to be excited about that. And she was skeptical. And I wonder if, because this is early on in Esme's career too, she's starting to figure out that she's got to put forth kind of that goal or the result, the outcome first. And because maybe it's perhaps the librarian only saw, oh gosh, now you're giving me another thing to do. Whereas if Esme, maybe she's starting to figure out that if she would have just pointed to that librarian's shared kind of passion of reading and imagination, that maybe the conversation would have gone a little bit differently.
Yeah. And okay, so to akin this to the workplace, you've got a young leader and you've got someone that's been in their job a very long time. And when you're a young leader and you've got someone that's been in their job a long time, they're going to be very resistant to new ideas a lot, frequently. It's a very common situation to have. And so as a new leader, you've got to be energetic, but you also got to know that it's a very sort of delicate situation. And, like Esme's doing, you've got to approach it. Sometimes you got to kind of skirt around or come around the side, and be able to engage them in a way that's going to work for them, or in essence, speak their language. Right. And so that's what Esme is trying to do. Right? She's trying to approach these folks not head on, but kind of come around and say, how could this work for them? How could this, how could I speak their language? And so in the workplace, when you've got these sort of ingrained employees and they're kind of dug into their little universe, you've got to kind of come around and how is this going to work for them? And how is this going to benefit them? Because all they're seeing when they look at you is this young, sprightly little leader who is inexperienced, who doesn't really know what life is going to be like. And they're not going to listen to you at 24, 25, 26, when here they've been in their job for 15 years because they know better than you do. So they're just going to wait you out. And so again, it's you're trying to get their buy-in, as she, in this case, is trying to get the librarian's buy-in. The late night calls. Mr. Turner had a bad habit in the summer before school started of calling Esme late at night. He usually wanted to bounce an idea off Esme for a meeting the following day. Esme would groggily spew some educational theory, and then in the room the next day, Mr. Turner would announce Esme's answer to the group, without giving her any credit, of course. He also called Esme up to be reassured that he had done well that day or to gossip about the other teachers. Quote, "If he were the sort of person who ever said thank you for anything, I would say, poor man, lonely man. People who don't say thank you, people who ask, what do you think? People who call people on the phone after a 12-hour workday, people who talk behind people's backs, well, maybe there's a reason that they're lonely. But I think I cured his late night hellos. When the phone rang at 11:30 the night before last, I let it ring. The machine answered it. He left his name. I set my alarm clock. At 3 a.m., my alarm clock rang. I called Mr. Turner. Ooh, did I wake you up? He grunted in reply. I'm so sorry. It's just that you called me so late. I knew you wouldn't call me so late if it wasn't terribly important. So I thought I'd better call you back. Last night, I had a phone-free evening." End quote. So Mr. Turner has turned into a leech. He's turned into this guy, like, he can't stop calling her. It's like he's become like codependent on her to have these calls. And I thought her way of handling it was hysterical and brilliant. Here she is now. She's going to create this boundary in a way that he can't possibly mistake it for anything else.
Well, and you could tell that this was, who knows how many calls in this was, but she clearly was tired of this routine. And here I find the irony, because he hired her seemingly because she showed independence, and this is anything but independence on his part. If you take it at surface level, but I don't know. I thought it was brilliant, though. I loved this technique, and I'm definitely going to put this in my back pocket for some time when I might need it.
Full disclosure, I've used this technique. It's 100% successful. Sometimes you've got to use it. So for our listeners who are going to try this, okay, sometimes you've got to use it more than once, but you've got to use the exact same technique more than once. So if you're going to try, so like in Esme's case, right? If it didn't work at 3:30 that night, you've literally got to try it multiple times. So she would have had to let the voicemail pick up again and then call him back exactly at 3:30 a.m. again and again and again. So it could have taken her up to like 3, 4, or 5 times. Then he would have eventually gotten the message. But you've got to do that because sometimes people are so like ingrained in that routine of like call at 11:30, she will pick up, that they don't notice that first time that you do it. They're like, oh, maybe she was out late. And they're so codependent that they need even that 3:30 a.m. callback. And it takes them a while to break the cycle. So you've got to try it. And it may be so bad that codependency, they don't care when you do your act. So yeah, again, you've got to try it multiple times, but the freedom that you're going to feel when that codependency is broken, you're not even going to realize how bad it was until it's gone. But wow, it's a nice thing. And it may feel awkward also at first because it may create a strain in that relationship between you and the other person for a while, until they really get over it. And they may go create that codependency with somebody else. So you also can't worry about that, because that may build a stronger relationship between them and somebody else than the relationship that they're now going to have with you. So you got to also keep that in mind and make sure that you're okay with that.
Well, I totally agree that setting these boundaries is really what we're talking about in a way that still respects. This is her boss, and if your boss comes to you and says once, it's kind of a slow slide. Hey, I need you to do this. Oh, couldn't you stay an extra hour? I really need you to do this. And then that hour maybe turns into 2 hours, or and the longer you keep that door open, there's no reason for your boss to think that they can't ask that of you. But at a certain point, you realize that it's gone too far, and how do you kind of draw that back in? But what I thought was so brilliant about her, the way she voiced it, was that she still made Mr. Turner realize that she felt his calls were important, but she put a spin on it to draw that boundary, of, okay, I really want to place this importance on what you're trying to tell me, but let's do it at a at the time when we're both awake. I think that probably hopefully was a stark realization in his mind. And so if there's any way to kind of place that importance on whatever your boss is telling you, but put it in a light like, hey, I can see this is a really important project. I want to put it at a time in my schedule when I'm freshest. So I'm going to put it on my calendar and block off 8 a.m. to 10 p.m., 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. because that's when I'm freshest. I want to put my best work into it.
Oh, but I think she's also a little bit bitter. I think, she was saying he's done. He never says thank you. It's these 12-hour work days. She's a little bitter. And I think that that's really hard. I think that people often will bend over backwards to help their boss or to help out at work if somebody simply says, thank you. But I've been in situations in workplaces before where honestly, like those two words, I'll do anything for you. Anything you need at all. Call me in on the weekend, ask me to stay late, whatever. I'll handle an issue for you. I will come in. I was in one job one time where I was known as what's called a rescue swimmer, wherein I used to take over things when they were drowning, because I would just grab them, take hold of them, and fix them. And I didn't mind doing that ever. First of all, I'm an adrenaline junkie, so I kind of love that adrenaline rush. That's a whole nother podcast to talk about that. But I never minded doing that because I always got a thank you at the other end, and that's all it takes. And I think what she's saying here, part of it is, if he just said thank you, I wouldn't have such a hard time with these 11:30 p.m. calls, and my boundary, maybe it would be a little bit looser. But this guy, he doesn't even say thank you, and so now not only am I forced to create a boundary because I want some sleep, but I'm going to create it because I'm tired and I work for him 11 hours a day. He never says thank you in these nighttime calls. He also never says thank you. And then the next day, he's stealing my freaking ideas and he's not even crediting me with them. So bitter, sure. Tired, obviously. And this kind of stuff is what wears you down over time. And the fact that she's a first-year teacher and she's already spotting these red flags, kudos to her, because this is the kind of stuff that's going to end up running her out of the profession and is going to just grind on her over time. Reframing and finding creative solutions. Esme's class had 30 kids. Quote, of the 30 kids, all were Black except for about 5 Mexican kids and one girl who was from Pakistan and one from the Philippines. End quote. Esme tried to make her classroom a home for the students. She greeted them at the door every morning and had a worry box where they each placed their worries that were bothering them before they walked into the classroom. That way they could focus on their work for the day rather than whatever situation they had left behind at home that morning. Esme also renamed all of her subjects and got creative on how to teach them. Math was puzzling, science was mad scientist time, social studies was time travel and world exploring, language arts was art of language, and reading was free reading time. Quote, I did this because I figured kids at this age come to me with preconceived notions of what they were good at. End quote. It was Esme's theory that her students would do just as well in the annual standardized testing if they were able to truly learn, rather than if she taught them straight out of the approved textbooks. Her theory worked. That year, her students all gained 2 to 3 years on the standardized testing, and some even tested at grade level. That was incredible progress, given that when they arrived in her class, many did not even have basic phonics skills, nor could they even do simple math. So, in her first year of teaching, she comes up with these creative ideas to sort of reframe this problem and go around these established procedures and sort of this established way of solving things to be able to sort of think outside the box and create greater success than I think anybody expected her to have.
Well, and if you think about, these kids are in fifth grade, so they've been in this, system of learning for a couple years now. And so I imagine them walking through the door kind of those first days of the school year, and their world is kind of shaken up a little bit. And I feel like teachers like Esme are such a gift to kind of that, because of that variety. And I felt like she was always trying to get to the core issue of what she was trying to teach those students and get them excited and kind of to think differently about the material that was being presented to them.
Yeah, and I mean, think creative things like the worry box. I mean, these are all, she works in a rougher neighborhood of Chicago. All of these students, as you know, she tells over and over in the book, are all coming from very difficult sort of family situations. And so in the morning before they come to school, they're often already faced with challenges. And so beginning their day in the classroom by enabling them to leave those challenges at the door, she's enabling them to focus on schoolwork. And so she's already creating this positive learning environment that they probably haven't had from kindergarten through fourth grade. And so again, it's this creative problem solving method that it's not like she got taught that. She came up with that. And so I think this is, again, it's a lesson for leaders, right? There's not things you aren't going to learn in a book, right? Great example, worry box, not going to learn in a book. You can read 100 books on leadership, but you've got to stop highlighting and putting Post-its all over these books. You've got to get out there and try things out and think outside the box for creative solutions for your team. It's not going to be these solutions that work for everybody else's team. It's going to be, look at your environment, look at things that your team is struggling with, look at context. Look at reframing the problem, look at it from 360 degrees, look at it different angles, different perspectives. Unlike, fifth graders, your team is probably adults. Maybe they can give you feedback. Maybe you can look at a historical perspective, right? What's worked, what hasn't. Esme was able to look at her school and their families and, what maybe has worked and not worked from kindergarten through fourth grade, right? What's worked on standardized testing, obviously not the textbooks, right? So again, perspective. And, I think that being able to look at all of that in totality and then add your creativity on top can often find good solutions. For reading, Esme took a cassette recording sample of each of the children's oral reading abilities. They were having such difficulty even sounding out the words that she decided the class would make an alphabet museum for the kindergartners. Each day she assigned a letter and students brought in something interesting for that letter the following day. For the museum, there would be 26 desks with the fifth grader behind each, as well as 2 kids to greet the kindergartners at the door and 2 kids reading ABC books when the kids finished viewing the display. The Alphabet Museum allowed the fifth graders to get their alphabet practice without feeling ashamed. Okay, so another very creative idea. She's identifying a way to allow her students to learn while not shaming them at the same time. And so it's sort of playing to their strengths without making them feel incompetent.
And it's giving them an opportunity to be creative and individual. And like you said, it's free of that shaming or free of this, why don't you know this? It's just giving them, kind of a garden to kind of just grow within. It's like the very positive environment. And what I saw in that opportunity for creativity was really making these children more resilient, and we hear that a lot about creativity, is that the more opportunities for it, the more resilient children are going to be because they have an opportunity to solve problems and overcome them.
Yeah, and with that resiliency, I think what you also see is you're making children not fear things that they don't know, right? And so you're allowing them to maybe in the future, if they don't understand something, or if they don't, maybe they think that they're the only one in the class that, doesn't understand a concept after the teacher explains it. Maybe they'd be more willing to ask for help, because maybe they'd understand that there's no shame in asking for help. And here she has them teaching kindergartners, and yet they know that they don't know that information themselves. So I think that it was actually this layered sort of approach, and this layered lesson for the students that kind of like reached out and kind of touched their subconscious in ways that they had no idea it was doing, which she does over and over and over again during the school year. And I think that these are lessons that at such a young age, I mean, what are these kids, 10, 11 years old? These are going to be things that they're going to be able to take with them as they mature, and they don't even know it yet. And that's a gift that I think teachers a lot of times give students, that, students come back to them, 10, 15 years later, and they're like, wow, this was so impactful in my life. And I just think that's one of the things that teachers, it's incredible. Esme also set up a classroom library and bought books out of her own money for the library. She ignored the reading textbooks on the theory that grown-ups don't read textbooks unless they're forced. They read books. Her rule was that she would leave the books out for the kids so long as they didn't steal any. She counted the books out and in each day. One day, they were a book short. Esme told the class that the book needed to be returned. By the end of the day, it still had not been returned, so Esme followed through with the consequence she had already laid out for the children. She locked the reading cabinet and made the kids use the reading textbook. After a few days of whining kids and boring reading time, the missing book was returned and the reading cabinet was reopened. I really like this example because she gave them something nice, but when they didn't do what they were supposed to do with it, she followed through with the consequence. And I think way too often people don't follow through with the consequence. And so you start to not trust that they're going to. And so no one listens to that sort of end of the rule, so to speak.
Well, and she was clear about setting those expectations, and whether or not they had seen the follow through in action yet. I think she's setting herself up to be able to communicate expectations next time, and they'll understand that she means business. And what I was really thinking about, what does it mean to hold someone accountable as well, because I've struggled actually in trying to discern those times when I should be owning the solution to a problem, owning an outcome myself as a leader of a team, but when do I hold other people accountable, and what does that look like? And I think actually I had a little bit of an epiphany, because she didn't, whenever that book was returned, she didn't pull whoever aside and put them in front of the class and publicly shame them or anything like that. It was, she didn't need that. She knew that that person would take care of that on their own. But I think what I took away from that was that I could hold someone accountable if there was something really truly in their realm, in a private way, through a private conversation, and say, hey, I really had expected you to do XYZ and you did this. Instead, let's do this next time. But I think holding someone accountable in a private way might actually be a positive learning experience. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Well, I think in this kind of a situation, I think that that person needed the time to process that accountability requirement, because the entire class was in essence being punished for that person not holding themselves accountable.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually that person figured that out. I just think it took them time, because my guess, they had never been held accountable for anything. Or if they had, it wasn't anything that they cared about. So they had to finally figure out, holy crap, this matters. I'm being held accountable for something that matters. And the fact that I'm being held accountable is impacting other people. And so I think that they had to work through that on their own. And sometimes those lessons that we have to work through on our own end up impacting us, and we remember those more. And so I don't know that her taking that person aside afterwards and kind of, I call it lecturing them, but kind of working through that with them, I don't think that that would have been of any more benefit to them. I think that they had worked through that themselves. They returned the book. They knew by the time that they returned the book that they were being held accountable for that book, because they had finally worked through that. And so I think sometimes, being a leader or a boss, when you give out that expectation and you hold that person accountable to that expectation, I think that when whatever that consequence is that you're going to hold them accountable for, right? Whatever that expectation is you're expecting, and then you hold them accountable to that, there's a consequence to that. And when you put that consequence on, presuming it's something that they care about, the impact is there. And so I don't think that, you necessarily have to say, okay, here's the consequence / impact. Now, I don't want to, here it is. So don't, you probably don't want to have that happen again. If they feel it enough, if it impacts them enough, and if that consequence is something they don't want to experience again, they're not going to do it again. So it's, it's like, I akin it to like a child putting their hand on a hot stove, right? It impacts them enough. The consequence is bad enough. They're not going to do it again. Whereas for a child, if you take a toy away for 5 minutes, impact and consequence not enough, they're going to do whatever that thing is again, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and I can imagine that also the shared consequence also helped with the impact, because the whole class was missing out on this thing that they had grown to love, that she'd really set this foundation of love for reading. And so I can imagine the talk amongst those 10-year-olds saying, man, really just wish someone would bring that book back. I'm really missing this. And so kind of that indirect kind of peer pressure of seeing how it was their decision was impacting everyone else. I think that probably also had a lasting effect.
Oh, I'm sure. Again, big impact, big consequence. And I was thinking, as I was reading this, I was thinking a lot about work, and a lot about teams, and a lot about making sure that you are very clear when you're giving an expectation about what that accountability piece is going to be, and what's going to happen if that sort of expectation isn't met. But you got to be very, very clear about what that expectation is. What is that deadline? And what is that work product supposed to look like? Because if all you say is expectation is project X is going to be completed by date Y, but well, okay, what is project X? Like, what is that exactly going to entail? Because when you say it should be completed can mean something totally different to you than it means to your team. So I think just, again, being very clear, and then what is that consequence that's going to be attached if it's not completed? Because you can't make up that consequence when it's not completed, right? You gotta tell them what's that sort of stick on the back of that carrot. Inventors. In November, Esme's class studied Inventors. While the kids were at gym class one day, Esme dressed up in an outfit with all kinds of weird stuff sticking out. Rubber bands, gum, chocolate chip cookies, light bulbs, and had a tag saying who invented them. She also wore roller skates. Quote, Mr. Turner was nervous when he saw me, but I'm good at roller skating. Boy, he would have been really nervous during my science magic show if he had seen me put a piece of paper I had set on fire in a bottle to illustrate Bernoulli's principle. Of course, I had a fire extinguisher near, but certain people just think it's their job to freak out. As long as they're freaking out, they feel busy, like they must be doing work. Getting upset is force, but no motion. Unless we are moving the children forward, we aren't doing any work. End quote. Huh. People who enjoy freaking out. I think everybody works with at least one person. I call them the Tasmanian devil, but they literally think it's their job to freak out. And all that does is, at least I think, stresses them out. I know it stresses out the people around them.
Yes. The hands flailing and everything's kind of being dramatic. There's a dramatic twist to everything. And I'm not really sure why that has to occur because I feel like I like the calm, cool, collected environment myself. But, just not being surprised that that exists is good for us to all remember.
Now, don't get me wrong. I said earlier I'm an adrenaline junkie. I totally am. So I get revved up at the moment that I get like a project that I know is going to rev me up. And then when like something really fun happens on that project, I definitely get revved up. And when I'm done with that project, oh yeah, very happy. But I'm not one of these people that like 24/7 is a drama queen. I don't like the back and forth emails. If our listeners, I'm sure you've got that person at the office that just pound, I call them keyboard warriors, but like they love to pound drama into every email. They will keep email strings going just to like pound drama back and forth. They're emotional. They are, it's like paragraphs. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy on email. They also love the cooler Shakespearean tragedies. I don't totally know how to deal with them other than disengaging and not responding. That doesn't seem to slow them down at all. But it's just I try and stay away from them, but yet I'm for some reason they're very attracted to me. But yeah, it increases my like stress level. I can feel when they're near me or they're emailing me, my stress level goes up, and I have not yet figured out a way to really handle them other than that disengagement.
Oh goodness, yes, we like to call that circus. Um,
Yes, we do. That's what, yes, Sonia and I call this the circus. And by the way, in case people are curious, there are some good emojis on the iPhone for the circus.
yes, we check in on each other's circuses frequently. So, the other thing I thought was funny was Mr. Turner was nervous when he saw me, and she was clearly, you could imagine her decked out in this Inventors outfit and everything. And I think sometimes it's the routine of workplace or home or whatever. There's certain people that would like everything to look the same and to be conformed to the way that they want it to be seen because it makes them comfortable to see that familiarity. And she was just ever creative and ever pushing the envelope and getting outside the box. And so I think that probably Mr. Turner also just never knew what was going to happen next with Esme, and she was kind of unpredictable because he wasn't like that, and so I could see that he probably felt challenged by her as well, and sometimes that sets people off as well.
Agreed. Greek gods. Esme covered the Greek myths with her students, and they were very engaged in the stories. One day, they were tracing and cutting out a shape of their body and coloring it in to create themselves as their favorite god or goddess. Mr. Turner walked into the room as the kids were, quote, on the floor, laughing, cutting, and coloring in a fabulous mess. They didn't stop because he entered. There's no control, he mourned. There absolutely is. I raised my thumb, which is a signal for attention, and like a magic trick, within 12 seconds, every mouth was closed. 31 thumbs were in the air to show that they got my signal, and all eyes were on us. Just checking, I explained. The kids went back to work. It's not that I'm so great or that they love me so much. It's just that I'm consistent, and they know if they do not follow my guidelines, I will be a dragon lady. Still, I love seeing Mr. Turner's face just then. End quote. Here we are back at the expectations and boundaries, and people will appreciate knowing where you stand because this consistency provides stability.
I really needed to hear this. I think that it's given, it's a good framework to work within to know that you can just, if you can work through what those expectations are and communicate them and then be consistent about them, there will be progress and that's, like you said, that stability. And people, they do want that. I think that when work can be so variable and every day can throw those surprises at each of us, that stability really can bring people, keep them grounded.
I need the predictability to be a good employee. So if your boss is unstable, your job becomes unstable, and you then have to waste time trying to navigate around that. So not a good situation. if you're unstable and unpredictable as a boss, you're causing the same thing in your employees. So, though it's very, very tough, sometimes emotionally, to be stable and sort of that predictable, because it can be hard, because you have to do that tough right. You know what? It's going to benefit everybody. So again, I would just, on those days where you're like, God, I just don't want to be the mean dragon lady, you got to do it. Long-term payoff. Cajun Christmas. For the International Themed Christmas Assembly, Esme had her kids do a Cajun Christmas dance routine. It was ambitious and had complicated parts. Quote, but under the threat of death and homework, my 31 charges learned them meticulously, baring their teeth in a mandatory smile all the way. I'm exaggerating. I know they kind of enjoyed the rehearsals, the anticipation of performance and success. They know I would never let them fail. That's why they do what I ask, no matter how much they complain. End quote. Okay, so here she's got her kids buy-in. They are literally buying into what she's asking them to do, even though they think she's kind of crazy, because she always leads them to success. Here it is Christmas time. It's December, probably November when they're practicing. And so she's had them for 3 months. She's obviously very clearly made them successful at almost everything she's tried with them. So now they're like, okay, we'll try crazy teacher's new plan, because everything that she's tried with us basically has worked.
She really developed relationships with her students, I think, at this point. And so I feel like she was much more in tune and aware of their potential and how they were doing as far as kind of the grind factor. And she was willing to, because she had that connection to each of them, she knew how far she could push them and when they maybe would have reached that breaking point. I thought it was interesting, she knew that they were just complaining. Now, complaining is kind of not necessarily an indicator of like fatigue always, but I feel like if I could be very in tune with my team and have built relationships with them to the point where I'd be able to better identify their potential when we're reaching that potential, or when we're pushing beyond a point where they're about to break. I think that's so important, and it's just really remarkable that she was able to get there with her students.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think you need to be cautious and you need to make sure that, especially when you're a new leader, that you're taking those small steps towards reaching your employees' potential, so that you're watching very carefully when you hit it. I think it's also important not necessarily to listen to your employees about what they think their potential is, because 95% of the time, okay, maybe 99% of the time, what people think is their potential is not their potential. They can go way beyond that. So, listen to them, but take that with a grain of salt as well. Read aloud time. Quote, read aloud time is my favorite time. We are starting King Mat the First by Janusz Korczak. It has hundreds of pages. It could take the rest of the year. It's so good, about a country run by a little boy king. Korczak was a pediatrician who ran an orphanage in Warsaw. He wrote the book for his charges. Eventually, they all perished in the Holocaust. It's a good follow-up to Number the Stars by Lois Lowry about the Danish resistance, which they read over the winter break. I bought all 31 copies myself, but it was worth it. The kids love the book so far. Even if I read for 40 minutes, they complain when it's time to stop. Every chapter ends with a bit of a cliffhanger. End quote. Okay, so for our listeners, this book that Esme's reading about the orphanage in Warsaw is about the orphanage that we talked about in Irina's Children. So just to let you know, I found it so impressive that Esme is reading books with her students that transcend cultures and history.
Well, and it was something that she clearly knew about, and she just seems like a very educated and inquisitive person herself. She just wanted to know about lots of different people and lots of different things. And what really I found so special about this time is she was trying to share this very special and memorable story with these kids. And if it takes, you know, the rest of the year to get through this story, she knew it was going to be worth it. And those kids were going to have this kind of shared experience of hearing this really special story. And I think it was in the end going to bond all of them closer, having had that shared experience.
Yeah, and so you can analogize this to leaders and teams. Have shared experiences with your team. It will bind you together. Don't allow your team to only work alone. You need to have that teamwork, and they will whine and they will complain about having to have these shared experiences because everybody just wants to go off on their own and do their own work. But in the long term, they are very good to have. We aren't here to be liked. Miss Clark, the special education teacher, tried to do a whole class lesson on her own for Esme's class because she knew she didn't give the class as much attention as they deserved. Esme warned the class to be on their best behavior. She sat in the back grading papers. The class was a total nightmare. They weren't paying attention, they defied Miss Clark, and they demanded bribes to do their work. Miss Clark offered stickers, but Esme had other plans. Quote, "What do you get? What'll you get?" I roared, suddenly becoming visible. "You'll get an education, that's what you'll get, which is more than you deserve for the rotten way you've been treating Miss Clark. You aren't getting stickers, you aren't getting brownies, you aren't getting please and thank you. You're getting work, and you'll work double the assignment that Miss Clark gives you. I'll be checking on it. Now, who else wants to get something?" Nobody else did. I thought I'd hear a chorus of tongue clucking, but I didn't hear a peep. Everyone got to work. A couple of kids even quietly apologized as they passed Miss Clark to go to lunch. Alone together, Miss Clark wept dainty tears from her luxurious lashes. "I just want them to like me," she squeaked. "It's not our job to be liked," I reminded her. "It's our job to help them be smart." End quote. So the situation here was the special education teacher had come in to teach this class lesson, and Esme's class was incredibly disruptive, and they wanted something from Miss Clark in exchange for doing the lesson. And Esme's in the back of the classroom just basically like, "Are you kidding me? No, you're just going to do this lesson." And at the end, she's trying to teach Miss Clark a lesson as well, which is, you're not going to buy their love. And even if you could, that's not your job and that's not what you're here for. And I think, again, akin this to the leader, right? You're not here to be liked. You're here to be the leader. And I think that this is something so often that leaders miss. You're not here to be loved by your team. You're here to be their leader. And if you're going to be loved by your team and you're going to get really close to them, you can't do your job as the leader. So, you've got to make that tough decision.
Yeah, Esme, she also sought. She showed that respect is most important in this situation. She didn't undermine Miss Clark's authority necessarily. She actually, even though she knew she wasn't seeing her hold that same standard for the student, she still wanted to hold it and also kind of show the students that they have to respect all those teachers, even if, they aren't seeing the same type of leadership in front of them. And the other thing was, it was such a poignant moment where she was telling Miss Clark, it's not our job to be liked. And I've definitely felt that pull and tension to want to be, liked, and probably more so earlier in my career, as I was I'm still consider myself a young leader, but I feel like it's clear to me that it's about that respect and about leading the team, and not necessarily going out for drinks all the time or, being on that same plane all the time, but you can still make positive relationships with each member. It just might look a little different.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Like, you want to build relationships with the team members. I just think you need to be cautious about, how close are you getting, because you do still need to be their leader. So that and be effective. Teachers' meetings. Teachers' meetings drove Esme crazy. Quote, "All these people conspiring to make children's days as boring and as meaningless as possible. All the meetings are variations on a theme. How can we all be the same and get the children to do likewise? On any given agenda. Lines and keeping the children in them, the proliferation of talking and how to stop it, textbooks and state goals. Are all the children learning what everyone else is learning?" End quote. Okay, so Esme's incredibly creative. We know she's incredibly creative. We've been talking about it for the better part of, 40, 45 minutes. And then she goes to these meetings, and these teachers and the school leadership have this myopic vision of, what to do. And this is why I think people get stuck in ruts. And this is what bothers Esme so much. It's this teaching to this, not to standard, but just to this sort of just procedural sort of way of doing things. And again, management got stuck in these ruts of, we've done it this way for so long, this is how we're going to continue to do it. And I think with teachers under this pressure to teach to these standardized tests, here's a textbook, we're going to teach the textbook because we got to teach the test.
Well, and I think in those, like you say, these ruts, you can kind of, it's easy for these people to lose sight of what is the actual goal in all of this. It's not to ace these tests. It's to, if we really, we really want that goal to be that these students are learning, like she said, it's their job to help them be smart. And I mean, I know for probably all of us, meeting can be a very dirty word, because we've all been to those meetings and probably still continue to, that, are questionable as to why is it even in existence. But I think that her desire to be engaged is so strong that I can see her being very disengaged by these meetings that are, like she said, meaningless and goalless.
Oh, meetings. I mean, we can, I think we should start making a list of things that we could talk about on podcasts for an hour. And I know like half our listeners just laughed. Meetings. I mean, the disengagement of meetings that go on longer than 15 minutes. It's just, and meetings that repeat over and over. I used to sit in this meeting that we had every week for an hour. And the first 35 minutes was repetitive. It drives me nuts. And honestly, if you can summarize a meeting in 5 bullet points, email me the 5 bullet points and I will read them every single time you email them. But if you make me sit in a room for 35 minutes, I'm either on my phone doing other work, I'm on my laptop doing other work, or I'm just sitting there thinking about other work. I'm not listening to your top, what you're saying. And I think Esme probably was much the same way. I mean, it's the, she's sitting here saying we're talking about the same thing, and she's probably sitting there thinking up all these creative ways to get her students to learn.
Yeah, and what I've really taken from Esme is that she doesn't waste her thoughts. Like we're hearing about all these fantastic creative things that she's showcasing in the classroom, but that that there has to be all that planning and kind of just thoughtful brainstorming time that she is carving out somewhere, but she has to be very efficient about it. And so I think that meetings need a place and a time. There's a time and place for meetings, I guess is what I'm saying. And it needs to be a really useful tool. Otherwise, it loses very quickly its place in our lives.
And here's a good tip if you're going to have a meeting. Make an agenda and put 3 to 5 bullets under each of the agenda items. If you can't do that, then probably the agenda item shouldn't be there. And if you can't do that, for the entire agenda, then the meeting shouldn't be there. When the team doesn't perform, quote, rotten day at school. Why? I went in with a positive attitude, but then a package of stickers was stolen, and that just made me so mad. It's so aggravating when one of them decides to shit on me in the class like that. It's just wrong, wrong, wrong. I tried to put it behind me, but it wouldn't go. I vowed at least to try not to misdirect my frustration and be cheerful for the kids who don't steal. But the children came back from gym and clearly had not done their homework, so they couldn't participate in the game show style lesson I had planned. Greedy and slothful. I was disgusted, but I tried to maintain. I failed. Got so mad. It's depressing. I always start out well, smiling and whirling around like I'm on a commercial trying to sell them the rest of their lives with no down payment until July. But the kids act so obnoxious, clucking their tongues, groaning, swearing. They are really such wimps. They can't do anything without a complaint. End quote. Okay, so here we have Esme, who's generally, at least when you're reading about her, she's close with her students, but not like too emotionally involved. And then you get her in this paragraph being very emotionally involved and with the students, and with that emotional involvement, she's too frustrated. And now she, in a way, can't perform her role as that teacher. She's gotten a little bit too close.
Yeah, we see her humanity here definitely, and we've all been in those places where the day just keeps going more and more in the wrong direction, and no one seems to be helping it get back on track by their own individual actions, and it can get so frustrating. And it also shows us the importance that there has to be a place to kind of for those emotions for each of us as leaders to kind of be able to work through and express ourselves. And but it's not necessarily in front of that group or in front of that team or in front of that classroom necessarily. I think that it shows the importance of those emotions, but I think I need to remember that, but also see the importance of collecting myself before getting back in front of the team.
Yes, self-care so important for leaders. So, we talked a little bit about this with Tilda Shaloff and the ICU book that we were reading about. But you've got to engage in self-care because otherwise stuff just eats at you, especially emotional things. And so, whatever that self-care may be for you, reading, writing, meditation, exercise, family activities, I have a friend who's incredibly passionate about kayaking. I have another friend who's very much into her dog, another one into CrossFit, another one into, whatever. Everybody's into different things, but, you've got to have that release valve. And for a lot of folks who work extremely long hours, they don't have the release valve. And eventually that becomes a problem because your pot boils over. And so not just for leaders, but for everybody, I think, that's incredibly important. So think about that, Storytelling festival. Okay, so we're back to the festival. Esme won a small grant to host Storytelling Festival. She coordinated the kids' theater performances, the theater sets, some games, some storytelling areas, and giveaways. Esme also got other teachers to volunteer. This was no easy feat in a school like hers. The event was held after school, so Esme was concerned about how many students would attend. She needn't have worried. There were over 100 there. The theater performances went off without a hitch. Each student that performed received a certificate and a much-deserved applause. The administration, Mr. Turner, and the assistant principal, Ms. Coyle, were, as always, unsupportive. Esme had tried to get them to videotape the kids' presentations, but they had declined to give her the resources. They also complained that she should have had the event in the common area, not in the library. They arrived late to the event, likely just planning, as always, to criticize Esme and the work she had done. That was until they saw the people who came from the granting agency to watch the event. Mr. Turner and Ms. Coyle coddled up to them, telling them how much they had invested in getting the event to happen, how supportive they were. Esme was infuriated, but not surprised. Afterwards, Mr. Turner asked Esme to have the students perform their stories again so that he could videotape them. Esme politely declined. Esme always wondered if the students were enjoying all the extra effort that she put in to provide them with creative classroom work and opportunities. After the storytelling festival was over, a third grader came up to her asking if they could do it again tomorrow. Quote, "It was so gratifying. I don't know if everyone enjoyed it, but I know it was nice for a few kids. And isn't many used to tell me that if you can do that in a real way, that's the most you can ever hope for as a teacher." End quote. Okay, so Ismene was her mentor before she started teaching, and so I love this way that she discusses the storytelling festival and the the credit that Mr. Turner and Ms. Coyle took. I mean, poor Esme, right? She puts all this work in, and I love that she just wasn't even surprised when here they come walking in and take credit for it all. But the amount of passion and work ethic that she had all year long to do all of this work. I mean, she was just amazing.
Yeah, these situations suck if you ever find yourself in them, and I'm sure we all have. And they're kind of two different things. Like, it's very frustrating if you feel like, like Esme did, just put all this work and energy and effort into it, and someone kind of swoops in and they take away the best parts of it, or you can, and you have a choice there. You can either get really upset outwardly about it, but she was polite and really humble at this point. And the other instance it occurred to me that is similar maybe to this is when you get thrown under the bus and someone else is, giving you the credit of the wrongdoing. And so this is just a great lesson to stay humble in those situations and, maybe draw some boundaries and work through it. But also what I really took away is that the people who matter can see who the true credit is due. And those children, they knew she was putting so much effort into it. And whether or not Mr. Turner and Ms. Coyle were going to own up to it and recognize it as well, the people who mattered, which in this case were the students, they really could see where that value was.
Yeah, so I want to go back to two of your points. Being humble. I mean, that is probably a leader's best quality. And it's not being too humble, because then you stray into all kinds of problems. And that gets really irritating for people. But being humble as a leader and giving the credit to your team, and not going out there and being like, I did such a great job on this project, boss. Like, look at me, I'm amazing. Or even like saying it to your coworkers that you did a great job. That's annoying. But just going out there and doing your best work and doing a good job every day. And, look, in the long term, you're going to get the credit. It's going to come. And even if it doesn't, you're going to know you did a good job. And isn't that enough? I mean, why do you really need the praise from other people? You don't. So being humble, incredibly important. And the second thing, you mentioned impacting others that matter. They're going to know. And I think that goes to your team. If you do a good job with your team and you're a good leader, your team is going to know that. And word's going to spread, because they're going to tell other people, and those people then will tell other people. And so at the end of the day, the people that matter, they're going to know. And, your peers are going to find out, and upper management may or may not find out, but do they matter? I don't know. Maybe they matter for promotions, but you know what? Word travels, and good word travels. Bad word travels faster, but I don't know. I think at the end of the day, people find out about these things. How do I know I'm doing it right? Ismene, a fifth grade teacher and Esme's supervisor while she was student teaching, once told her, quote, "The difference between a beginning teacher and an experienced one is that the beginning teacher asks, 'How am I doing?' And the experienced teacher asks, 'How are the children doing?'" End quote. I pulled this quote because I think it's perfect for leaders. I think a new leader asks, "How am I doing?" because they're still focusing on themselves, because they're trying to learn how to lead, and they haven't yet turned around to ask, "How is my team doing?" Because they don't yet know that that's the most important thing. They don't yet know that it's about the team and it's not about them.
I was thinking about what fills in that gap, what fills in that transition. How do we get from asking the first question to the second question? And I mean, it's just, a lot of it is just time and experience. And for me, and probably a lot of new leaders, it's trial and error. I tell my interns, I learn most of what I do because I don't have a degree in it necessarily on the job. And the most effective way in that instance in learning is trial and error, because you don't want to make the same mistake twice. But I think that was really, a great way to kind of look at ourselves. Like, what are those questions that we're asking, and how can we pinpoint where we are kind of on that spectrum of growing as a leader?
And on that note, that's all we have for today. Thanks for listening to Esme's story and sharing this experience with us. You can also interact with us, follow us, and learn more about upcoming episodes on our website at modernathenas.com, on our Facebook page under Modern Athenas, our Twitter at Modern Athenas, and our Instagram at the Modern Athenas Podcast. We would also appreciate if you support our podcast by leaving us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and subscribing to our podcast. In our next podcast, we will be discussing the book An Improbable Friendship by Anthony David. As we leave you today, we want to remind you to never forget that each of you, like all of the modern Athenas we have discussed throughout our podcasts, has the power and capacity to be a change maker in your world. Work hard, dream big, and reach for the stars.